Picture this. It is 865 AD inside a Danish longhouse. A messenger has just finished speaking. The silence is absolute, but the violence has already begun. 4 brothers sit around a table. They are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Sigurd, snake in the eye, is holding a small knife, idly paring his fingernails. As the news of his father's murder sinks in, he doesn't scream. He doesn't look up. He just keeps cutting. He slices past the nail, through the skin, and carves straight down to the solid bone of his finger. He doesn't even feel it. Across the table, his brother, Bjorn Ironside, is holding a chess piece carved from solid bone. His grip tightens. There is a sharp crack. The chess piece explodes in his fist. Shards of bone drive deep into his palm and blood begins to drip rhythmically onto the wooden board. This wasn't grief. This was a declaration of war. This was the exact second the revenge of the Great Heathen Army began. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand this bloody reaction, you have to understand the insult. The messengers confirmed that King Aella of Northumbria hadn't just killed Ragnar, he had tortured him. He had thrown the legendary Viking into a pit of vipers to die a slow, humiliating death. Stripped of his armour and his glory, Aella wanted to prove that Ragnar was just a man. But with his dying breath, Ragnar laughed at his killer. As the venom took hold, he choked out one final prophecy. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered so. King Aella thought he was ending a threat. In reality, he was lighting a fuse. He forgot that the old boar had sons, and those piglets were now the most dangerous warlords in Europe. The reaction in Denmark was immediate. There were no tears, there was only mobilization. Sigurd pulled the knife from his bone. Bjorn wiped the blood from his hand. They sent out a call that reached every corner of the Viking world. This would not be a raid for silver or slaves. They didn't care about treasure. This was a mission with a single, brutal purpose: extermination. Warriors flocked to their banner from Norway, Sweden and Ireland. Rivals put aside old feuds. Mercenaries refused payment just to be part of it. They were all drawn by the magnitude of the target. King Aella believed he was safe in his stone fortress across the sea. He had no idea that he'd just summoned a force unlike anything England had ever seen. The Great Heathen Army was launching, and they were coming to ensure that every single person involved in Ragnar's death would die screaming. In late 865 AD, the sentries on the coast of East Anglia looked out at the horizon and saw something that stopped their hearts. Usually a Viking alarm meant 3, maybe 5 longships. Fast, hit-and-run raiders. But this time the horizon itself seemed to be moving. Hundreds of dragon-headed prows cut through the Ura mist. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a floating city. It was a migration of death. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply refers to it as the Misel here, the Great Host. It wasn't just warriors. It was smiths, women, children and horses. They weren't coming to steal silver and leave. They were coming to take the land, burn the crops and dismantle the kingdoms of England brick by brick. And at the head of this massive force was not the strongest brother, Bjorn, or the most stoic Sigurd. It was the cripple, Ivar the Boneless. History has debated for centuries why he was called boneless. Was it a brittle bone disease, inability to walk, or was it a metaphor for his unnatural flexibility in combat? The sagas tell us he was often carried into battle on a shield. But make no mistake, Ivar was the brain of the operation. While his brothers were fueled by rage, Ivar was fueled by a cold mathematical cruelty. He understood that to kill a king like Aella, you didn't just need axes, you needed a strategy. Ivar knew that Northumbria was too strong to attack directly from the sea, so he made a move that confused everyone. He didn't sail north to Aella, he landed his massive fleet in East Anglia. He bypassed his target. Why? Because Ivar was playing the long game. He terrorised the locals of East Anglia not into fighting but into submission. He demanded horses. He turned his sea-borne infantry into a mounted cavalry. He spent the winter gathering intelligence, sharpening blades, and letting the fear of his presence drift north like a plague. He was letting King Aella wait. He was letting the dread build. Ivar knew that the anticipation of pain is often worse than the pain itself. By the time the snow melted in 866, the Great Heathen Army was no longer just a mob of angry Vikings. Under Ivar's command, they had become a professional machine of war, mounted, supplied, and hungry. They turned their eyes north. The little piglets were done grunting. It was time to hunt the boar. While the Great Heathen Army was sharpening its axes in East Anglia, the Kingdom of Northumbria was busy destroying itself. It was the perfect storm. The Northumbrians were embroiled in a bitter civil war. The usurper King Aella, the man who killed Ragnar, was fighting against the rightful king, Osbert. They were so consumed by their hatred for each other that they didn't notice the shadow creeping up from the south. Civil war is a gift to an invader, and Ivar the Boneless accepted it with open arms. In the autumn of 866 AD, Ivar made his move. He marched the army north, utilising the horses he had extorted from the East Anglians. They moved with terrifying speed, bypassing smaller villages, aiming straight for the heart of the north, the ancient Roman city of York. But Ivar didn't just choose the target. He chose the time. He waited for November 1st, All Saints' Day. Consider the brilliance of this. On All Saints' Day, the entire noble class, the military commanders, and the bishops would be gathered inside the cathedrals. They would be unarmed, distracted, and deep in prayer. They were expecting a feast. They were expecting divine protection. What they got was the heathen army. The Vikings struck York while the church bells were still ringing. The city's defences were manned by skeleton crews. The gates were breached before the Northumbrian leaders even finished their hymns. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre in a sanctuary. By the time the sun set on All Saints' Day, the capital of the north had fallen. Ivar didn't burn York to the ground. That would be the mistake of a common raider. Instead, he occupied it. He repaired the Roman walls, he stocked the granaries, he turned York into a Viking fortress deep in enemy territory. He sat on Aella's throne and waited. He knew that the fall of York would force his enemies to stop fighting each other and come to him. He was counting on it. He wanted Aella and Osbert to unite. He wanted them to bring their armies to the walls of York. Why hunt the mice when you can put down a piece of cheese and wait for the mice to come to the trap? It took 4 months for the Northumbrians to swallow their pride. 4 months of watching a heathen army sit in their capital, eating their food and mocking their gods. Finally, in March of 867 AD, King Aella and his rival Osbert shook hands. They combined their forces into a single, massive army. It was a crusade before the word truly existed. They marched on York, convinced that God was on their side, ready to drive the pagans back into the sea. On March 21st, Palm Sunday, the Northumbrians attacked. At first, it looked like a victory. The Northumbrians slammed into the old Roman walls of York with the fury of desperate men. They found gaps in the defences. They broke through the gates. A cheer went up from the English ranks. They poured into the city streets, thousands of them, flooding the narrow alleyways of York, thinking they had the Vikings on the run. But they didn't understand who they were fighting. Ivar the Boneless hadn't lost the walls. He had abandoned them. He had invited the English inside. As soon as the bulk of the Northumbrian army was squeezed into the tight, winding streets of the city, the traps snapped shut. The Vikings appeared on the rooftops. They emerged from the side streets. They locked their shields at both ends of the main avenues, turning the city of York into a claustrophobic killbox. The advantage of numbers vanished. In the close quarters of urban combat, the long spears of the English levies were useless. It became a brawl of axes and knives. The panic set in immediately. The Northumbrians were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons. They were butchered where they stood. King Osbert, the rightful heir, fought bravely, but he was cut down in the chaos, his body trampled into the mud of the city he tried to save. The crusade had turned into a slaughter. But amidst the carnage, the Vikings had specific orders. There was one man who was not to be killed. The sons of Ragnar were watching the battlefield, scanning the faces of the dying, looking for one specific crown. King Aella saw his army disintegrate. He saw his rival die. He realised with a dawning horror that the walls he had just breached were now his prison cells. He tried to retreat, but the path was blocked by a wall of Danish shields. He was surrounded. He was dragged from his horse, stripped of his weapons, and forced to his knees in the mire of blood and dirt. The Battle of York was over. The silence returned to the city, broken only by the groans of the dying. The Vikings didn't execute Aella on the spot. That would have been mercy. Instead, they bound him in chains. They looked at him not with anger, but with a terrifying sense of anticipation. The war was finished. The ritual was about to begin. The Great Hall of York had seen many kings, but it had never seen a trial like this. King Aella was dragged into the centre of the room. He was covered in mud and blood, his royal robes torn, his crown long gone. Around him stood the victorious chieftains of the Great Heathen Army. But Aella's eyes were fixed on the 4 men sitting on the dais, the sons of Ragnar. Bjorn Ironside sat with his massive arms crossed, looking at Aella like a butcher looks at a side of beef. Upper played with the handle of his axe. Sigurd, snake in the eye, watched with that unnerving, unblinking stare. But the terrifying presence in the room was the man who couldn't even stand up. Ivar the Boneless lay on a pile of furs, his twisted legs useless, but his eyes burning with a cold, reptilian intelligence. This was the moment the prophecy came full circle. Aella looked at them and saw the little piglets his prisoner had warned him about. But they were not piglets, they were wolves. Historical records don't give us a transcript of what was said, but the sagas paint a picture of terrifying intimacy. Ivar didn't scream. He didn't rage. He likely spoke softly. He would have asked Aella about the pit. He would have asked about the snakes. Did my father cry out? Did he beg? How long did it take for the venom to stop his heart? Every question was a knife twist. Ivar was forcing Aella to relive his crime, to admit that he had killed a hero without honour. Aella had denied Ragnar a weapon to die with. Now, Ivar would deny Aella a quick death. In the Viking code, a clean death, a decapitation or a sword to the heart, was a mercy. It was respectful. But Aella had forfeited his right to respect. He was not a prisoner of war. He was a criminal who had violated the sacred laws of conduct. There was no negotiation for ransom, no offer of exile. Ivar signalled to his guards. They didn't drag Aella to a dungeon. They dragged him out to a nearby hill. The time for talk was over. The sons of Ragnar had decided on a punishment that would echo through history, a method of execution so horrific that, for centuries, scholars refused to believe it was even physically possible. They prepared the ground for the Blood Eagle. The location was likely a high ridge, visible to both the Viking army and the terrified survivors of York. King Aella was forced onto his stomach. His hands and feet were staked into the ground, stretching him taut. He was no longer a king, he was a canvas for Ivar's masterpiece. The Blood Eagle, or Blodorn in Old Norse, is perhaps the most infamous method of execution in human history. For a long time, historians argued it was just a myth, a scary story told to frighten children. But for King Aella, on that cold Northumbrian afternoon, it was physically, agonisingly real. The executioner, likely Ivar himself or a specialist chosen for his surgical precision, approached with a long knife. This wasn't a clumsy hacking, it was anatomy. First, the skin of Aella's back was sliced open. 2 long curved incisions were made along the spine, from the shoulder blades down to the lower back. The skin was peeled back like flaps of parchment, exposing the layer of red muscle and the white cage of the ribs underneath. At this point, Aella would have been screaming in a way that stripped his throat raw, but consciousness, cruelly, would have remained. Then came the hammer and chisel. This is the part that defines the torture. The executioner didn't just cut, he deconstructed. One by one, the ribs were severed from the spine. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of snapping bone would have echoed across the silent field. The ribs were then forced outward, bent back to resemble the spread wings of a bird. The man was being turned inside out. But the ritual wasn't finished. With the chest cavity now open to the air, the executioner reached inside. The final act was to pull the lungs out from the chest cavity and drape them over the broken ribs. As the lungs collapsed and fluttered with the dying man's final, ragged breaths, the movement of the red tissue looked like the beating of wings, a blood-soaked eagle trying to take flight from the ruin of a man's body. Medical experts today suggest that Aella likely died from traumatic shock or pneumothorax, the collapse of the lungs, before the process was fully complete. But the Vikings believed that if the victim cried out, he would not enter Valhalla. Aella screamed. He died not as a warrior, but as a sacrifice to Odin, his body transformed into a grotesque symbol of Viking dominance. When the deed was done, Aella's body was left there, a warning to every other king in England. The debt was paid. The old boar had been avenged. But as the sons of Ragnar wiped the blood from their hands, they realised something. The rage hadn't subsided. The adrenaline was still pumping. Aella was dead, but there were other kings in England. There were other torturers, and the Great Heathen Army was still hungry. With Aella dead and Northumbria broken, a normal army would have gone home. They had their revenge. They had their justice. But the Great Heathen Army didn't turn back to the sea. They turned south. In 869 AD, they returned to East Anglia, the kingdom where they had first landed. King Edmund of East Anglia had given them horses 3 years earlier, hoping to buy his safety. He thought he had a deal, but Ivar the Boneless didn't honour deals with men he considered prey. When the Vikings returned, they didn't ask for horses, they asked for the kingdom. King Edmund was a pious man, a devout Christian who refused to fight a war he couldn't win, but also refused to submit to a pagan overlord. He was captured near Hoxne, and here Ivar decided to make another example. If Aesella's death was about anatomy, Edmund's death was about archery. According to the Passion of St. Edmund, Ivar ordered the king to be tied to a tree. He wanted to see if the Christian god would save his faithful servant. The Viking archers lined up. This wasn't an execution by firing squad, it was torture by volume. They fired volley after volley. They didn't aim for the heart or the head, that would be too quick. They aimed for the arms, the legs, the shoulders. The chroniclers wrote that Edmund was shot with so many arrows that he resembled a hedgehog, his body bristling with shafts. Pinned against the bark of the tree, bleeding from a dozen non-fatal wounds simultaneously. Throughout the ordeal, Edmund refused to renounce his faith. He kept calling out to Christ. This infuriated Ivar. The boneless commander had no patience for martyrs. Bored with the game, Ivar gave the final order. A swordsman stepped forward and severed Edmund's head with a single blow, tossing it deep into the thick brambles of the forest so his followers couldn't bury him whole. King Edmund the Martyr died not because he killed Ragnar, but because he stood in the path of the avalanche. His death sent a clear message to the remaining kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. There is no negotiation. There is no neutrality. You either die screaming like Aella, or you die praying like Edmund. But either way, you die. By 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army had effectively decapitated 2 of the 4 great kingdoms of England. Northumbria was a puppet state. East Anglia was a graveyard. Next on the list was Mercia, the massive kingdom in the Midlands. The king of Mercia, Burgred, looked at the fate of Aella and the fate of Edmund. He saw the blood eagle and the hedgehog. He realised that the sons of Ragnar were not men you could negotiate with, nor were they men you could beat. So Burgred made a choice that history has judged harshly. He didn't fight, he didn't pray, he ran. As the Vikings advanced on his capital at Repton, Burgred abdicated his throne. He took as much gold as he could carry and fled to Rome. He died there, an exile, buried far from the land he was sworn to protect. It was a pathetic end to a once proud lineage. The Vikings didn't even have to unsheathe their swords to conquer Mercia. Fear had done the work for them. Now look at the map of England. It is almost entirely black. Only one kingdom remained independent, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. Wessex was the last stand. If it fell, England would cease to exist. It would simply become a western extension of Scandinavia. The Great Heathen Army knew this. They turned their attention to Wessex with the weight of an avalanche. But in Wessex, they found something they hadn't encountered before. They didn't find an arrogant tyrant like Aella, or a passive martyr like Edmund, or a coward like Burgred. They found a young man named Alfred. At this time, Alfred was not yet the Great. He was a sickly prince, plagued by chronic stomach pain, often overshadowed by his warrior brother, King Ethelred. But Alfred possessed a weapon that Ivar the Boneless respected, a brilliant tactical mind. When the Vikings attacked Reading in 871, the battles were brutal and inconclusive. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex bit back. But the sheer numbers of the Viking invasion of England, bolstered by a second wave of invaders known as the Great Summer Army, were overwhelming. When his brother died, Alfred took the crown in the middle of a war zone. He looked at the exhausted state of his army and did the unthinkable. He paid the Vikings to leave. He gave them a massive tribute of silver known as the Danegeld. Critics might call this cowardice similar to Burgred, but there was a key difference. Burgred paid to save his own skin. Alfred paid to buy time. He knew he couldn't defeat the Great Heathen Army in a pitched battle yet. He needed to reform his military, build ships, and study his enemy. He was buying 5 years of silence. As the Vikings took the gold and settled into their conquered lands, believing Wessex was pacified, Alfred sat in the dark watching, planning and waiting. The sons of Ragnar had killed the torturers. They had conquered the weak, but now they were facing the architect of their downfall. In 870 AD, after the execution of King Edmund, the most terrifying man in Europe simply vanished. Ivar the Boneless disappears from the English historical records. He leaves the Great Heathen Army in command of his brothers and fades into the mist. For centuries, this sudden silence puzzled historians. Did he retire? Was he killed in a skirmish? To find the answer, we have to look across the Irish Sea to the annals of Ulster. Here, Ivar reappears under the name Imar, the king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. It seems that after breaking the back of the English kingdoms, Ivar returned to his stronghold in Dublin to rule as an emperor of the north. But the gods are known for their irony. Ivar, the man who engineered the Blood Eagle, the man who turned cities into slaughterhouses, did not die a warrior's death. He wasn't cut down in battle. He didn't ascend to Valhalla with a sword in his hand. In 873 AD, the annals record that Ivar died of Kisnada, a sudden hideous disease. The man whose mind was a weapon, but whose body was a burden, was finally betrayed by his own physiology. It is a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a figure of such legendary violence. He died in his bed, likely surrounded by looted gold, but defeated by his own biology. However, legend offers a different, more haunting ending, one that fits the myth better than the history. According to Viking folklore, before he died, Ivar ordered his body to be transported back to England. He gave specific instructions to be buried on the coast, at the very spot where the Vikings first landed to invade. His prophecy was that as long as his bones remained in the English soil guarding the coast, no foreign invader would ever successfully conquer England. It is said that for 200 years his curse held true. Viking raiders, Danish kings and Saxon struggles, none could truly take the island, while Ivar watched from his grave. The legend concludes in 1066. When William the Conqueror prepared to invade England from Normandy, he was superstitious. He'd heard the stories of the Boneless Guardian. The saga claims that William actually found Ivar's burial mound. He dug up the corpse, which, remarkably, had not decayed, and burned it to ashes on a pyre. Only after Ivar's physical form was destroyed did William feel safe enough to launch his conquest. Whether he died of disease in Dublin or kept watch as a skeletal sentry on the English coast, Ivar's legacy was undeniable. He'd come to avenge his father. He left having destroyed 2 kingdoms, executed 2 kings, and fundamentally altered the DNA of Britain. The little piglet had grown into a monster that devoured the old world. But with the monster gone, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. The war of vengeance was over. The war for the future of England was just beginning. When the screams finally faded and the smoke cleared, the map of England had been redrawn forever. The revenge of the Great Heathen Army was a complete success. They had hunted down every single man responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. King Aella was a bloodied ruin. King Edmund was a headless martyr. The north and the east belonged to the Vikings. But revenge is a strange thing. It starts as a fire to burn your enemies, but it often ends up forging a new world. The Vikings didn't just kill and leave, they stayed. They traded their swords for ploughs. The lands they conquered became known as the Danelaw, a massive territory where Viking laws, customs and language took root. If you walk through the streets of York today, or look at place names ending in by or thorpe across England, you're looking at the echoes of this invasion. Ragnar's death didn't just lead to the death of Aella, it led to the hybridization of a culture. The blood of the old boar and the blood of the English kings mixed in the soil to create something new. Ragnar Lothbrok died alone in a snake pit, laughing at his killers, believing his sons would bring glory to his name, and they did. But they also brought something else. Chaos. And out of that chaos, the Anglo-Saxons were forced to evolve. They needed a leader who was more than just a warrior. They needed a visionary. The Great Heathen Army thought they had won the war, but in the shadow of their victory in the swamps of Wessex, the young King Alfred was done paying them off. He was done watching. He was building the very first English navy. He was designing a network of fortresses called burhs. He was preparing to do the impossible to push back the tide. The sons of Ragnar had their vengeance. But the question remained, could they hold what they had taken? If you want to see how a sickly scholar king managed to defeat the greatest warriors of the Viking Age and earn the title the Great, make sure you are subscribed. Our next video will dive deep into the impossible survival of Alfred and the birth of England. Click that notification bell so you don't miss the counterattack. And before you go, let me know in the comments. Do you think the Blood Eagle was a real historical practice, or just a terrifying myth created to scare the Christians? I'll be reading your theories below. Until then, remember, history is written by the victors, but it's built on the bones of the vanquished.